The laundry on Willow Ridge. The first light over Willow Ridge came soft and silver, sliding across the wheat like a quiet breath. A whippoorwill called once from the cottonwoods, then the fields answered with their own morning sounds, the swish of grass, the distant creak of a windmill, the clink of a bucket somewhere down the lane. Beside a weather-beaten cabin, a young woman worked a washboard, sleeves rolled to her elbows, steam from the copper kettle purling against the chill. Her name was Clara Bell. She was 22 and already familiar with the particular ache that comes from lifting more than your share of life. Her father had died the winter after the big freeze, and her mother followed 2 springs later. What they left behind was a patch of soil with stubborn rocks, a roof that leaked like a sieve, and a dead marker thumb printed by a banker with a dry smile. Clara kept the place upright the way you keep a promise, daily, without applause. This morning, she had 3 baskets, one for the Mitchells up the road, one for the schoolhouse, and one for herself. Her green dress had been mended so many times it mapped the work of her hands like a private geography. Tiny neat stitches at the cuffs, a careful patch at the waist, a repaired placket with mismatched buttons she'd scavenged from a box in the barn. She scrubbed and wrung and pinned, the rhythm of it syncing with her breath. The sun lifted. Heat came on. A shadow crossed the yard. Clara looked up and saw a man stop a few paces short of the porch. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that didn't need to announce itself. A leather vest, sun-faded shirt, hat brim low. His eyes, clear, steady, took in the scene not like a judge, but like a person making sure where to put his boots so he wouldn't crush a violet. "Morning," he said, removing his hat. "Morning," Clara answered, wary because life had trained her to be. "Didn't mean to startle you. I'm Matthew Carter. Carter Ranch, West Pasture runs along your back fence." He nodded toward the fields. "I've been meaning to introduce myself proper." She knew the name. Everybody did. The Carters had kept cattle and weathered droughts out here for 3 generations. Word in town said Matthew had run it near single-handed since his wife passed 2 years back. Word in town also said he was careful with words and quick with work, which was the sort of arithmetic Clara respected. "What can I do for you, Mr. Carter?" He studied the sag in her clothesline, the split post tied up with rope, the patched roof. He took 1 step closer, but not so close that she would have to step back. "Fence along my north boundary came down last storm," he said. "Found 2 of my heifers in your creek, the shaded bend where it turns by the willow. You didn't have to, but you turned them back and wired the brake so they wouldn't wander." "I appreciate that." Clara blinked. She hadn't done it for thanks. She'd done it because animals deserved to be safe and because neighbors were the difference between a season making or breaking. "You're welcome," she said simply. Matthew glanced at her reddened hands. "You take in wash, most days. Cheaper than falling behind on the marker." He nodded once, as if he understood more in those 2 sentences than some folks learned in a year. "What do you charge?" 10 cents a shirt, 15 for sheets. More if there's lye needed. I've got a bunkhouse full of men who keep finding their way to mud, Matthew said. If you're willing, I'll bring a load by Saturday. Fair trade. Cash on delivery. Also, he gestured to the post, I can send my boy Jesse to reset that line for you. No charge. Clara stiffened. Charity had a way of souring the gut. I can manage. Matthew didn't argue. He tipped his hat. All right. Offer stands. He hesitated, eyes warming. You remind me of someone who didn't wait around to be rescued. World could do with more of that. He left before she could find an answer. He came back that Saturday with a wagon stacked high. Shirts, denim trousers, towels from the bunkhouse, a canvas tarp. He counted out payment in silver and put it in a mason jar on the porch rail without spectacle. He listened when she explained the schedule, boil, scrub, rinse, bluing, and didn't pretend to know better. He didn't crowd her space. He didn't talk when work was easier than talk. Week by week, the wagon returned. The money jar filled. When it rained hard, he sent a boy to ask if the creek threatened the back field. When her well pump stuttered, a new handle appeared on the porch with a note, for whenever the old one gives up. When gossip in town mentioned Clara's name too lightly, about a woman alone, about what aloneness must mean, Matthew's foreman, who liked his job, made it his business to shut the talk down. Clara told herself he was a good neighbor, nothing more. She kept telling herself the same when she learned he was good with calves and aging hounds and skittish children at the county fair. She told herself that when she saw him pause at the graveyard gate as if speaking to a stone brought him steadier. She told herself that when he said her name like a fact instead of a question. The trouble with telling yourself something over and over is that your heart doesn't always sign the agreement. Summer burned into August. The fields went gold and humming with grasshoppers. One evening, with sky the color of peaches turned in cream, Clara carried a basket to the porch and found Matthew sitting on the top step, hat in his hands. He rose immediately. "I should have sent word," he said. "Hope it's not an intrusion." "What's wrong?" He smiled like a person trying not to worry another. "We've got a sick mare in the foaling barn. Vet's on his way from Bardstown. Jessie said you know a thing or two about calming a frightened animal." Clara did. Her mother had taught her how to keep your breathing even, how to let a creature feel your voice before your hand. "I can come," she said, and set the basket inside. The barn smell was sweet and sour, hay and sweat and fear. The mare's eyes rolled white. Matthew stood in the pen, palm out, speaking low. Clara eased in opposite him and matched the mare's ragged breath. She talked the way you talk to a storm you hope will pass without breaking your roof. Easy, certain, patient. Matthew met her gaze across the horse's back, and in that split second there was a wordless pact. "Here, together, we will be careful." By midnight the foal lay slippery and blinking on the straw, all knees and miracle. Matthew laughed, the sound astonished and young, then looked at Clara as if she had pulled light out of the air. "You're good," he said. "So are you." She swallowed. "I mean, with people. The men listen because you don't waste them. The animals listen because you don't scare them into it." Silence settled, companionable and huge. Outside, the moon tipped silver across the yard. Their hands touched when they reached to right the foal, and neither one pulled away. After that night there were more moments that felt like the gate to a path opening. When a storm blew in hard and fast and a limb shattered the cabin's chimney, Matthew arrived with a tarp and 3 men before the first sheet of rain could drive through the gap. When a letter came from the bank, red ink, deadline, he stood on the porch while she read it, not offering advice, just offering presence. When he finally spoke, it was measured. "I can loan you enough to meet the marker," he said. "Fair interest, drawn up by a lawyer so you know it's clean. Or, if you're ready to sell, I'll buy the land and lease it back for $1 a season until you decide your next step." Clara stared at him. The offer was too generous. It made something old in her bristle. "You don't owe me rescue, Mr. Carter." "I know," he said softly. "And I won't push you. I'm not trying to fix you like a busted gate. I'm saying you're not alone if you don't want to be." Her throat tightened. "Why?" He lifted his eyes to the line of cottonwoods, like a man making sure his voice stayed steady. "Because someone I loved taught me that help is a language. I've been quiet a long time. I'd like to speak it again." Clara folded the letter. "Let me try one more season my way." "All right," he said, no disappointment, just a fact. "Your way it is. And if your way ever means borrowing my truck or my time or my shoulder, that's included." She didn't cry then. She waited until he'd gone and the wind had smoothed the fields back flat. Then she sat on the porch step, pressed the heel of her hand to her eyes, and let the stubborn grief and stubborn gratitude move through like weather. The season turned. The county fair came with its paper rosettes and powdered sugar and bright banners flapping on poles. Clara walked there on a Saturday with 2 pies and hope in a jar. Her dress, still green, but let out and resewn, fit like she hadn't given up on beauty. She set the pies on the bake-off table and wandered to the livestock ring where Matthew stood with a good-looking steer and a boy who had to be Jesse, 18, sunburned, proud as a drum. Matthew saw her and tilted his head, the kind of acknowledgement that made room for you in a crowd without calling a town crier. "Clara Bell," he said when she reached the rail. "That ribbon's got your name on it." She laughed. "You haven't tasted the competition." "Don't have to. I've tasted your biscuits." Jesse rolled his eyes with the particular suffering of a teenager witnessing adults flirt. "Dad, please." Clara blinked. "Dad." The word settled somewhere soft inside her. She'd known, of course. She hadn't let herself imagine what it sounded like from a boy's mouth, belonging someplace. "Ma'am," Jesse said, ducking his head. "Thank you for fixing my shirt cuffs last month. They looked decent in church for once." "You're welcome." Clara glanced between them. The boy, the man, the steer that would fetch a good price. Pride glowed off Matthew like heat off a forge. It wasn't the pride of possession. It was the pride of becoming. It drew her like warmth draws a chilled hand. The steer won a blue. One of Clara's pies did too. She walked home at dusk with a ribbon in her pocket and honey on her tongue, and for the first time in years the lane to her cabin felt shorter than her worry. Dash dash dash. Then came the bad week. First, the pump handle snapped clean at the base. Next, a letter. The school would send laundry to a commercial service in town. Cheaper by a nickel, cheaper than a woman alone could afford to be. Then, as if the county's luck had been stacked in the wrong column, Clara's old mare Winter took colic, hard and cruel. Clara sat with the horse on the barn floor, the smell of apple cider vinegar and lamplight and animal fear filling her. Winter had been her father's, stubborn and gray, the last living piece of a family that had once filled this land with voices. "Hold on," she whispered into the mare's hot neck. "I'm right here." The hours stretched thin. Near dawn, the hoofbeats she felt in the ground were not Winter's but a truck rattling down the lane. Matthew. He didn't waste time with greetings. He slid on his knees, checked Winter's gums, pressed a hand to the belly, listened. "We can walk her," he said. Already rising, already looping a lead. "Slow, steady, don't let her roll." They walked the horse in circles for hours, bracing, coaxing, talking low. At noon the vet's truck finally crested the ridge. Winter made it through the day and into the next, and then, the way some battles turn not because the army is bigger but because the ground decides it's done, her breathing evened. She slept. She lived. Clara sat down hard on the barn threshold and put her face in her hands. She wasn't a woman given to crying for show. This was not show. These were the sort of tears you pay for over years, and when they come you are relieved to be bankrupt. Matthew waited, one boot on dirt, one on straw. When she lifted her head, he didn't meet her with pity. He met her with understanding. "I almost sold this place last winter," she said, voice raw. "I told myself I was being sensible, but really I was tired of wanting things that keep leaving." "You didn't leave," he said softly. "That counts." The word counts landed like a steadying hand on the small of her back. She took a breath. "I can't carry all of it forever." "You're not meant to." Clara looked at him, truly looked, at the scar along his jaw, the fine lines at his eyes, the way he carried absence like people carry a photograph in a wallet, carefully, close. "Tell me about her," Clara said. "Your wife." He spoke of Elena without flinching. Summer hair, winter laugh. The way she'd taught him that apologies weren't a form of weakness but a kind of door. The way illness had narrowed their world to a chair, a window, a hand held too tight. He talked until his voice went quiet and the barn filled the silence with dust motes and the sound of an animal at peace. "I don't know how to love halfway," he said finally. "I warned her of that." She said that was the point. Clara nodded. "It is. They stood side by side like people at a graveside who understand that grief and gratitude often wear the same coat. Outside, clouds passed, then broke. Light fell in seams across the field. Dash dash dash. The next morning, Clara did something that felt like stepping onto a moving train. She took the bank letter, walked to town, and asked for Mrs. Harper, the only attorney who looked her in the eye the way a plumb line looks at a carpenter. They drafted a loan. Matthew's terms: fair, clean, no trapdoors. Clara signed her name with a hand that shook and didn't apologize for shaking. She walked out with the marker met, the cabin still hers, the season ahead not a cliff but a road. That afternoon, she cleaned the cabin top to bottom like a person preparing for company and not caring who saw the hope of it. She baked biscuits and burned the first tray and laughed and baked another. At dusk, she stood on the porch and watched the lane, not waiting, exactly, just practicing the way it felt not to be afraid when help might come. It did. Matthew's truck rolled in on the soft rattle of gravel. He stepped out carrying a coil of new line, a sack of seed, and a look that asked a question without forcing an answer. Clara answered anyway. "Stay for supper," she said. He did. They ate at the little table under the window, elbows brushing, conversation easy. He told her about Jess's plan to join the ag program in the fall. She told him about her mother teaching her to blue cloth by watching the sky, the trick of it being never to overdo. He laughed, and she saw what he had looked like before sorrow had carved him more serious. He listened, and she felt what it was like to speak without rationing yourself into pieces. After the dishes, he noticed the long crack in the window frame and set to work with putty and patience. Clara watched the line of his shoulders and thought of the day in the foaling barn when the world had felt both frightening and possible. She gathered the nerve courage often requires, which is to say she did not wait for a perfect sign. "Matthew," she said. He turned, hand stilling. "I'm not used to sharing the work of my life," she said, words careful. "It makes me feel like I'm stepping into a river that might take me somewhere I didn't plan. But I don't want to stand on the bank anymore, pretending I can drink without getting wet." His eyes gentled. "We can wade," he said. "Slow if you need, fast if you want, shoulder deep or ankle deep. I'm here either way." She smiled, relief and something like happiness loosening her face. "Will you walk the north fence with me in the morning? I'd like to see where the creek cut in. I've got ideas about the bend." "I'd like that," he said. Dash dash dash. They walked the fence at first light. Dew soaked their hems. A wild turkey startled and lifted off like a flapping joke. At the bend, Clara explained how a line of willow cuttings could anchor the bank. He listened like a student and offered labor like a partner. They set the first shoots together, bare hands in cool mud, future trembling with possibility the way leaves tremble when a wind decides to be kind. On the way back, a truck from the county rolled up the lane, a decal on the door, two men inside who wore authority the way some folks wear cologne, too strong, hoping you'll forget it can't hide everything else. "Miss Bell," the driver called. "We're here about the overdue property tax." Clara's stomach dipped. "I paid the marker." The man shrugged. "Taxes are separate. Deadline's tomorrow." "It is paid," Matthew said, easy as daylight. "Receipts at Mrs. Harper's office if you need a copy." The man flicked his eyes over Matthew's vest, his boots, his confidence, and recalculated. "We'll check." He tipped his hat and the truck kicked dust on the way out. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was keeping under lock and key. "Thank you. You did the work," Matthew said. "I just don't mind telling a bully that the math has changed." They stood there in the lane with the dust settling around their shins like a blessing made visible. Clara reached for his hand. He didn't startle. He just turned his palm and took hers like a man accepts water after a long day, grateful, ordinary, necessary. Dash dash dash. Harvest came. The creek stayed put. The willows caught root. The pump handle worked. Winter blew her warm breath into Clara's hair on cold mornings as if reminding her that persistence sometimes wins. The laundry baskets kept coming from the bunkhouse, and from the school again too. The board realized the commercial service broke more buttons than it saved pennies. Clara hired a widow from town 2 mornings a week, and they worked side by side, laughing in the steam, turning sorrow into bread money. On the night of the county harvest dance, a card appeared on Clara's porch step in an envelope addressed in Jess's careful block letters. "Would you and my dad come?" it said. "They're making me play fiddle. It would help if somebody clapped on purpose." Clara smiled until her cheeks ached. She stood for a long time at the cracked mirror, pinning her hair, smoothing the skirt of a new green dress she'd sewn with money she'd earned, one clean shirt at a time. Matthew arrived exactly on time, hat in his hands, tie crooked, face lit by a rare kind of anticipation. He looked at her the way a man looks at a horizon that might finally be home. "You look..." He paused, reset. "You look like yourself." "So do you," she said. They danced. Matthew wasn't a showy dancer. He was a steady one. Counted the beat under his breath, sheltered her from elbows, didn't mind when she stepped wrong and laughed. Jessie played a reel with more spirit than perfection, and people clapped not just to be polite but because joy is contagious when a boy decides to let it be. Afterward, on the long walk back to the truck under a sky punctured with stars, Clara stopped and turned to Matthew. "I keep waiting for the part where this feels like a mistake I'm making with my eyes open," she said. "But every day it feels more like a promise kept by somebody I used to be when I was brave." He reached up and touched the place just behind her ear where a curl had escaped its pin, and his voice was low, reverent, almost. "I don't know where this road goes. But I know who I want to share the dust and the shade with." Clara took his face in her hands and kissed him then. Not dramatic, not hurried, but with the certainty of a door being opened from the inside. Dash. They didn't hurry what didn't need hurrying. They built the habit of showing up. Matthew learned to blue whites to a laundry-lined sky. Clara learned the weight and sound of a calf that needed a bottle. Jessie learned that a house with 2 voices deciding supper was not a betrayal but an improvement. Winter learned she could nose Matthew's pocket for apples and get away with it. When the first frost came down like lace, they put storm windows on the cabin together. When the first thaw came, they planted a kitchen garden and argued cheerfully about the placement of the beans. When a letter arrived addressed to Mrs. Clara Bell from a cousin back east who had found her name in a Bible and wanted to know if she was still living, and if so, how, Clara wrote back with a picture of the cabin, the willows, the green dress on a line, the man and boy who stood beside her. On a Sunday morning that smelled like biscuits and saddle soap, Matthew drove them to the ridge where you could see 5 farms and a sliver of river all at once. The wildflowers had come up in stubborn yellows. He parked, killed the engine, and sat with both hands on the steering wheel for a second longer than necessary. "I've been thinking," he said. "So have I," Clara said, because she had. He turned, and the look on his face was the opposite of the way fear looks. "I don't have fancy words, Clara. I have useful ones. Stay with me. Bring your baskets and your stubborn and all the pieces you don't show people who don't know how to hold them. I'll make room. I'll learn as I go. I'll carry what I can and tell you when I can't." Clara's eyes stung, but not from sorrow. She took his hand, the same hand that had steadied a foal, reset a window, built a fence, quieted a worry simply by being present. "Yes," she said, "on one condition. Name it. That we go slow enough to feel it. Fast breaks things. I've had enough broken." He nodded, relief brightening his whole posture. "Slow enough to feel. Fast enough to be real." Jessie whooped from the back of the truck bed where he'd been watching the river through binoculars, pretending not to listen. "Finally," he said, grinning so wide it hurt to see how young he was allowed to be. They laughed, and the sound of it braided with the wind. People said later that it looked simple from the outside. a rancher and the woman at the edge of his west pasture deciding to build a life out of fences and flour and forgiveness. The people who said that were not wrong. They were just missing the best part, that simple isn't the opposite of holy. On the day they hung a new sign on the lane, Willow Ridge, Bell and Carter, Clara stepped back and pressed her palm against the rough wood as if introducing herself. She remembered every version of herself who had made it here. The girl with reddened hands, the woman counting out nickels for tax, the neighbor who said yes to supper, the person who decided not to stand on the riverbank anymore. Matthew came up beside her with a bucket of nails. "We did it," he said. "We're doing it," she corrected, and he smiled like a man who loved being corrected by the right person. They stood, shoulders touching, and watched the way the wind moved through the willows they'd planted together, the way the leaves shivered, then settled, then shimmered again. It looked like laughter translated into tree. Clara slid her hand into Matthew's. He squeezed once, a language they now shared. "I don't feel alone anymore," she said, the words a promise and a prayer at once. "You never have to again," he answered. And on a ridge that had witnessed their separate sorrows, the two of them stepped into a shared ordinary that was better than any legend, because it was true, and it was theirs, and it would keep being made every morning, with water steaming in a copper kettle and a fence line waiting for boots and two people who had learned the bravest way to live together.